Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. This week on the program, the long reach of Henry Kissinger's shadow, and why are we still living under it? We talk with professor and author Greg Grandin about his new book. Then later we take a look at the U.S.-supported coup in Honduras in 2009. All that and a few words from me on impunity and learning from the Guatemalans. It's all coming up. Welcome to our program. Is the empire rising or falling? Our next guest is just the person to ask. Greg Grandin has been examining empire in all its forms across 7 books, including his latest, Kissinger's Shadow. A professor of history at New York University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Grandin writes on U.S. foreign policy, Latin America, genocide, and human rights. He also served as a consultant to the United Nations Truth Commission on Guatemala. Greg, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you.
Hi, Laura.
So this new book has a very spooky cover, and the full title is Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman. First, I've got to ask you, I think of you as the Latin America guy. Why Kissinger? I mean, it's been 40 years since he's been in office. How did he get your attention?
Well, Kissinger obviously had a lot to do with Latin America. We could talk about the specifics, but Chile, Operation Condor, Argentina, the list goes on. I just thought he's 92 years old, and he's in the middle of this rehabilitation and embrace by both parties, by the Democrats, by Hillary Clinton, by Samantha Power, obviously by the Republicans, by conservatives. He has a major biography coming out by a very well-known, distinguished, and conservative historian. And I just thought that the left needed to kind of return and think about Kissinger not just as a war criminal. Mm-hmm. That's necessary, but not sufficient. That I think that Kissinger's life, looking at his long career, not so much his life, but his career, allows us to actually move beyond individuals and think about the broad strokes of American, linking Cambodia and Vietnam to today's endless war, today's national security state.
So where do you see his shadow?
Well, I see it everywhere.
I see it everywhere.
I see it everywhere. I think Kissinger, let me say, I don't think that Kissinger is singularly responsible for the permutation of the national security state into this monstrosity that it's become, but I think that looking at his life illustrates it, shines lights on it, and I do think that he does have a consequential legacy in what he did. I think there's ways in which you can go back to Cambodia, we can go back to Vietnam, and you can go back to many of the things that he did in the late 1960s and 1970s, first as Ford, Nixon's national security advisor, and then Secretary of State, and then continuing on with Gerald Ford, as both. In some ways, what I argue is that he hastens the breakup of the old national security state that comes out of World War II and presides over the early years of the Cold War, based on elite consensus, bipartisanship, and public support. And even as he's accelerating the breakup of that with his actions in Cambodia and Vietnam and Watergate, he's helping to reconstruct a new national security state, able to move on, and that's the shadow.
Because you say that in 1970 you would have thought the national security state, as we then knew it, was sort of suffering a major defeat and perhaps even on its decline.
Yeah.
Far from it.
Yeah, well, all of the post-Vietnam regulations that the Congress imposed, and the judiciary, and the public, and the dissenting public, and a skeptical public, a skeptical press, put on the executive branch their ability to wage covert operations and illegal wars or legal wars. And we look back now and we can see how those regulations were just in some ways a blip, that in some ways the whole first Reagan and then neoconservative project has been to figure out ways to overcome those, not just the regulations specifically, but the broader skepticism, public skepticism, and lack of will to war. And Kissinger, I think you could find the early steps of that bypass or workaround in Kissinger's policy.
Now, you go specifically back to the bombing of Cambodia and Laos. Remind people of this generation what that was, why it's so significant to specifically the story you're just talking about, and how many lives were lost.
Well, just to answer the last question first, Ben Kiernan, historian of Cambodia at Yale, estimates conservatively that 100,000 civilians were killed in the bombing, the illegal bombing, and mostly covert and secret bombing. The way it worked was that Kissinger conspired with Nixon to derail peace talks in 1968 prior to Nixon's election. Other historians have dealt with this in detail, and it's confirmed. There's little doubt that Kissinger and Nixon were involved in this, as well as a host of other people. That wound up prolonging the Vietnam War just to get a Nixon election for no reason. The war was ended in 73 on the same terms it could have been ended on 68. Nixon appoints Kissinger not just National Security Advisor, but makes him the most powerful National Security Advisor in history. Takes power away from the State Department, takes power away from the Department of Defense. And one of the things that Nixon and Kissinger do is that they need to end the war, that they just prolonged, and they need to force North Vietnam to the bargaining table and to make concessions so they can have peace with honor. And they can't start bombing North Vietnam right away for a host of other regions, so they start bombing Cambodia as a way of showing its resolve to North Vietnam. So it's almost a perfect expression of how, escalation, we have to escalate in order to de-escalate. There's a certain kind of, and between 1969 and 1970, late 1970, that bombing was completely covert and illegal. And it was legal throughout the whole, but it was covert. They figured out a whole very complicated way of carrying it out so the press wouldn't know about it, so the Congress wouldn't know about it. Kissinger's rationale for doing that, when he was called out on it at different moments in 70, 71, 72, was always the same, was that we're doing it to defend the U.S. soldiers. We're stopping the supply lines of North Vietnam, but arguments that were far out of the mainstream. Mm-hmm. Basically, we have to deny sanctuary to America's enemies, even if that includes bombing neutral countries we're not at war with. That was an argument considered completely fringe in late 1960s, early 1970s, to the point where many of Kissinger's conservative colleagues broke with him. Fast forward to 2014, and it is Obama's rationale for the drone warfare program, for the global counterinsurgency.
And in fact, Henry Kissinger argues, he defends himself now by saying, well, look at what they're doing now.
Yeah.
I was doing just the same. You mentioned that in the book, that he kind of uses this circular argument. Well, they're doing it, so
it's a perfect expression of the circularity of American militarism. Kissinger, in his last book was World Order, and on his book tour, most reporters gave him a pass. Nobody asked him any questions about Cambodia or Chile. One did on NPR on the takeaway, and his response was called out on Chile. He pointed to Libya and Syria and said, "Well, this is what Obama is doing." Called out in Cambodia, he pointed to the drone warfare program. Now, it's fascinating because what's interesting about that is Kissinger is invoking today's endless wars to justify what he did 40 years ago. But of course, the irony is that what he did 40 years ago made possible today's endless wars.
Well, let's talk about his motivation. You write that in 1968, everything he did after being appointed National Security Advisor, every policy that he advocated was in the interest of the United States. I think you write more or less verbatim, also turned out to be in the interests of Henry Kissinger. Yes. How so? And how do you see that trajectory from office to his out-of-office work with the consulting firm Kissinger Associates?
Well, there was starting with 68, starting with the way the derailment of the peace talks in Paris over Vietnam led to him being catapulted into one of the most powerful positions in the world. There was a fusion, I think, of self and society in his mind. I think that I try to use that to speak to the ultimate hollowness of his. Kissinger is often held up as somebody who believes in purpose, that America needs to know what it's, not just that it can do something, but why it's doing something. This is the kind of basis of his critique of whatever president is in power, that, they know what they're doing, but they don't know why they're doing it. But if you actually kind of dig out what he means by that, there's nothing there. There's a circularity to his reasoning that power creates purpose. Purpose is needed to create power. And this speaks to one of the arguments in the book that Kissinger's not a realist. He's actually an idealist. He actually is a kind of will to power philosopher of the deed. He doesn't believe, and this goes back to his training as a philosopher back at Harvard and some of his earlier education, but it runs through much of his writings up until his latest book, is that he believes that reality exists, but he doesn't believe that we have access to reality other than the actions that we take in order to make meaning. And the reason why that's important is he's often mistaken as a realist, and he's often juxtaposed, opposed to the kind of adventurism and the idealism of the neocons who drove us into Iraq, thinking that America was so powerful we could reshape the Middle East, we could reshape the world, we could reshape the terrain. And it is true that Kissinger and the neocons had political conflicts, particularly when Kissinger was in the Ford administration dealing with the fallout from Vietnam and loss in Southeast Asia. But Kissinger, one of the arguments is that he actually enables and makes possible the neoconservatives.
I mean, he does talk a lot about the need to project American potency around the world. I thought of Helen Caldicott's reference to missile envy. It's like, do we have a potency problem in this country? Maybe that's one motivation, but I am interested in the nuts and bolts, dollars and cents motivations behind this guy, because he's ended up with some of the most valuable clients in the world, we think. We certainly know he defended Union Carbide, the polluters of Bhopal. We know he's supported the privatization of some of the utilities across Latin America. The 9/11 widows wouldn't allow him to be appointed chair of that 9/11 committee because they thought he was too tight to Saudi Arabia. We still don't know who his client list is, right?
No, it's a private consultancy, so that he doesn't have. I mean, he gave up being chair of the 9/11 committee rather than reveal his Kissinger Associates client list. And there's a Republican senator, I can't recall his name, who said that client list is the most sought after document in all of Washington.
Before Hillary Clinton's emails.
They often some secure safe room in the bowels of the Pentagon where they would look at the list in order to make sure there was no conflict of interest, but Kissinger Associates wouldn't reveal it. So a lot of the stuff about what Kissinger Associates did, it's completely unknown. We do know that a lot of advisors that work with Kissinger Associates were involved in the privatization of Latin American industries. We do know that he has deep ties in Russia and China and in Saudi Arabia, but a lot of it we just don't know the details. But I think just to step back, because the danger of Kissinger is that we could take him as an agent of the deep state, and we could dive down the rabbit hole trying to make the connections and not really step back and see the bigger picture. Is that again, we see as Secretary of State, as National Security Advisor, he helps accelerate the terror in Latin America. That is the precondition for the privatization. And then as a private citizen, his Kissinger Associates benefits off the privatization. So again, it's another dimension of the perpetual motion machine of American expansion and militarism.
And just very quickly, his role in the Middle East, helping to bring us the peaceful and safe Middle East that we have today.
Yeah, the role is deep and insidious in ways that people don't even. I mean, he's the person who pumped up the Shah, elevated the Shah, which George Ball, a foreign service career official, said was an act of folly. And a lot of people, see that as leading to the radicalization of Iranian society. He's the one who allowed Iran and then Saudi Arabia buy whatever they want, basically using petrodollars in order to feed into the defense industry, which was hard hit after the Vietnam wind down. And then even beyond that, he after leaving office, he supported every one of the neocons' push, and he supported the first Gulf invasion. And in some ways, that whole spectacular lighting up Kuwait with night vision, techno power that was that first Gulf War was a perfect inversion of Cambodia. Cambodia was kept secret. Nobody saw it. The first Gulf War, there was months of public debate getting the public pumped up and ready to go in. And then there was all of the on-air commentary as if the reporters were turned into sports commentaries, football, and so that was a perfect flowering or realization of Kissingerism.
And he was one of those commentators.
He was one of those guys. He's everywhere. He's on every.
I heard him interviewed about his book, and at the end of the interview on public radio, I think it was Scott Simon said, "Would you be comfortable with a Hillary Clinton presidency?" And he said, "I would be very comfortable with a Hillary Clinton presidency." One of the more frightening things I've heard. Where do we stand in terms of this guy's influence today, and what does that tell us about Hillary Clinton? In addition to, as you said, she calls him her friend, she says she consults with him, etc.
Right. Well, there's two ways, I think, of thinking about Kissinger's rehabilitation. One, just to step back, Bill Clinton started the Democratic embrace of Henry Kissinger, and partly that was because Kissinger was instrumental in getting NAFTA passed. Under George H.W. Bush, Kissinger helped negotiate NAFTA with Carlos Salinas, the president of Mexico, and then after Clinton became president, he helped Clinton get it through Congress. It was Kissinger who came up with the idea of bringing all the ex-presidents for the signing, behind Bill Clinton. So there was already, the Clintons were already beginning the embrace. Hillary Clinton protested the invasion of Cambodia back when she was at Yale. Now she wrote a review there's two things. I think one is there's real interest that we only have a glimpse of, where like in Plato's we can only get shadows of what the real interest is. But also, I think things are so bad, and the U.S. foreign policy is so bankrupt and so paralyzed and not knowing what to do. ISIS. They don't. That Clinton, it's almost pure affect, right? I mean, to sidle up next to Kissinger.
We don't know what to do, so we'll call on Henry.
Well, because he invokes gravitas and purpose, even though my point is that there is no the there after the purpose, but he symbolizes it. He symbolizes seriousness.
Thanks so much, Greg Grandin. The latest is Kissinger's Shadow. You can find a link to this book and all Greg's previous books and interviews on this program at our website. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
If the Guatemalans can send their war criminals to jail, why are ours still walking around? It just so happened that I was reading our guest Greg Grandin's new biography of Henry Kissinger while the news was breaking in Guatemala. After 30 years of civil war and many years since in which killers have transitioned seamlessly from being murderers to making money and staying in power, Guatemalans said no more. For months this year, they've held mass protests demanding prosecution in a corruption scheme that rigged trade deals for kickbacks and robbed one of Latin America's poorest nations of millions of dollars. This August, hundreds of thousands of people from all sectors of Guatemala's very divided society surrounded the National Palace and refused to leave until Congress voted to strip President Perez Molina of immunity from prosecution. The Congress did it on fear of being on the wrong side of an angry populace just weeks before a national election. What sent President Perez Molina and a slew of his cronies to jail was a mountain of financial and banking evidence. But what kept people in the streets, people say, was Molina's history in the military. As a young commander, he led an army unit in a particularly brutal region that saw tens of thousands of people slaughtered, mostly by the military, in the 30-year Civil War. Impunity corrodes democracy, people said. We can't even call ourselves a democracy when we let oligarchs evade the rule of law. Molina was just settling into his jail cell this September as Chileans marked the 42nd anniversary of the coup that Henry Kissinger helped to mastermind. Kissinger's gotten away with murder there, as well as in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, Southern Africa, Indonesia, and Iran. As Greg Grandin points out, his shadow extends over today's devastated Middle East, and he's still walking around free and smug at 92. As one Guatemalan columnist put it, Guatemalans finally lost their patience. What the heck explains ours? Write to me. Tell me what you think. Laura@grittv.org. And thanks.